Good morning, everybody. Thanks, Stephen, for inviting me. I'm really honored. Thanks, Jeff, for helping put this together. I thought what I would do is just tell you a little about my personal experience, how I came to write for the Times and why I do it, and also some things I learned that might be interesting and relevant to your career, as journalists and covering various issues in mental health. But first, I want to say that when I looked at the program, I was really glad to see that you said psychiatrist/journalist and not the other way around, because I think of myself primarily as a doctor, as a psychiatrist who writes. And I do practice journalism without any qualifications or schooling. And a funny story, my former chair, Jack Barkas, happens to live on the same floor as Arthur Sulzberger, who is the former publisher, whose son is now the publisher. And one day Arthur, who I know, went to Jack and said, "Do you know this guy, Richard Friedman? I think he's in your department." And Jack said, "Oh yeah, I'm his boss." So Arthur said, No, I'm his boss. The reason it's funny is because whenever I get mail from outside now coming to Cornell, it reads Richard Friedman, The New York Times, with the right address at Cornell. So it doesn't make any difference what you say to people. They believe what they want to. So I actually never intended to write for a newspaper. And the way it really came about was many years ago, I started getting phone calls from journalists seeking expert advice about studies, various issues in mental health, starting on the science side of the Times. And it was clear to me that they had a lot of questions, and many of them, and these are really smart, analytical people, had to do with how researchers came up with their findings, meaning the methods and the design of studies and the statistics and all the sort of nitty-gritty about how the science is conducted. And then one day I got a call from the editor who said, "Do you want to write a few things since you seem so opinionated?" So I said, "Okay." So I started writing for the science section, and I did it for many years and covered lots of different topics. Basically, talking about new findings and studies and talking about what they meant and what their implications were. And then I started to feel, that it felt a bit like a straitjacket, that I was very interested in the bigger implications, and I wanted to talk more broadly about some of the issues and even come up with ideas that were not necessarily related to findings that were relevant right now. So I wrote a op-ed. It actually all started with a dog. I love dogs, and I had one in around 2000. It was probably the best of all of the dogs I've ever had. And this was a dog with human-like intelligence and was musical, and I'm a pianist, and the dog would sing. And I know it does sound crazy, but it's true. And when he died, my father said to me, I just read an article about how somebody had just cloned a cat. Maybe you should consider cloning him. And I thought about this. And I thought about it at lunch, and I decided, no, it's a really bad idea to clone your pet for all kinds of reasons. And I wrote an op-ed, which went viral. It was one of those things, because everybody loves animals. And it was the first op-ed I ever wrote. And after that, then the editors started saying, well, whatever's interesting to you, why don't you write about it? And that's actually how it started. And then I would write about what was very interesting in the field. And I discovered that in the field of psychiatry, there's so many people who write about what we do, and the public is so interested in human behavior, especially because they want to know how they work, what makes them tick, that the people who write about psychiatry are usually doing it from the outside. And I decided that if we don't write about it ourselves and don't talk about it ourselves, others will do it for us. And they usually do it in ways that are inaccurate, sometimes unflattering, and sometimes being unflattering is truthful, but often it's distorted, it's selective. People, I've discovered, and I think you all know this by experience, we love data that agrees with us, and data that disconfirms what we believe is hard to process, and we discount it, or we just ignore it. And I decided that I wanted to write about those things and try to overcome some of those obstacles. And I thought, as a psychiatrist who works on the inside with patients, I had a unique perspective. I knew what these experiences were like from the point of view of the patient and the doctor. I knew about the studies, and I was expert in only a few things, right? I am an expert in mood disorders, particularly depression. And if you're going to write about lots and lots of different things, obviously you're not an expert in it. Though I'm a psychiatrist, I had to call up my colleagues and, the principal investigators on studies and say, wait a second, I just read this study of yours, and this study seems to overturn everything we believe, up to this point, and just explain to me how you did this study and how this was actually structured. I recently read a study, and you probably will see this or hear about it in Nature and Neuroscience, that addresses the whole issue about, what the impact of, modern digital technology is on the human brain and on well-being. And basically, it was a huge, enormous study of about 350,000 kids from 3 different databases, one in the UK, the Monitoring the Future study in the US, and then another big database. And they did a very fancy statistical analysis that was essentially running iterations of every possible combination of variables. They had hundreds of thousands of these. And if you do that, by chance, you're going to get a lot of positive findings that are false positives. And what they did was they calculated that, there was a small significant effect, bad effect, of technology on, attention, various measures of human wellness, but it actually accounted for about 0.4% of the variation of wellness in the population, which might be statistically significant, but it's meaningless. And in fact, it was on par with, if not smaller than, the effect of wearing reading glasses, eating French fries, and doing any number of sort of day-to-day activities. I thought was a really smart, well-done study. It hasn't gotten a lot of press yet, but that's the sort of thing that I think is interesting. You come up against findings that you have a question that seems intuitively appealing to you. Everybody believes, for example, digital technology must be doing something bad because these kids are walking around and people are walking around the street glued to their phone. So you postulate they have a loss of social connectivity. Their relationships are impoverished. And then you look at other things that are going on in the environment, like the fact that adolescent rates of depression are going up and the rates of suicide are going up. And then you take those two things and you say, oh, well, they're happening at the same time, and so maybe they're related to each other. And, it's appealing because it's linked and it's a correlation, but obviously correlation and causality are really, really different things. And when you see studies like this that are very carefully done, and you realize that there's so many things that we think about with mental health that might be intuitively appealing because we want to believe them. A lot of people want to believe, let's say, that digital technology is bad for you. That when you see something like many of the studies that are done on smaller samples saying how harmful it is, you think, well, yeah, I can believe that, and here's a study that says this. So I started to write thinking first I would use modern neuroscience and research findings to weigh in on, socially relevant, events, either things of everyday life or politics, which is, even more difficult, and because there's so much that actually is going on right now that you'd want to write about, and it's sort of like endless. The problem is not finding ideas to write about; it's selecting which ones you want to actually focus on. So I learned along the way that there were things that I saw in the coverage of mental health that I thought we could do better, and one of them is the way that people with mental illness are depicted in the media, in the popular media. Because mental illness is stigmatized, and for example, people have a very common, I'll just put it to you this way. If I ask you the question, you're walking down a dark street, let's say, and on one side of the street you see a businessman in a suit. He looks slightly intoxicated. He's well-dressed, good-looking person. On the other side of the street is a psychotic, homeless person muttering to himself and shouting. You have to decide which side of the street you're going to walk down. Can I see a show of hands? How many people would pick the guy in the suit and walk down that side? How many people would walk down the side of the muttering psychotic person? Okay, so it turns out those of you that pick the muttering psychotic person pick the safer alternative, because the intoxicated businessman who's on alcohol is much more likely to be violent, right? So it's counterintuitive. You know, it goes against everything you believe. This very scary person who's muttering, yes, he's slightly more likely to be violent than the average non-psychotic person, but the actual risk is small. Whereas this intoxicated businessman is probably 6 or 7 times more likely to be violent. So it's that kind of thing, so that the public has this perception that people with mental illness are, you know, likely to be violent. And this comes out all the time. For example, when you think about all the mass shootings. And why is it that people have this view of the mentally ill as dangerous? Well, one reason is, if you think about it, yes, it's true. Mass killings are really awful, but they account for less than about 0.2% of all homicide. 0.2%, right? But they get 99% of the media attention. You don't hear about the other, 29,000 gun homicides that happen per year. They don't make the front page of newspapers. You hear about the equivalent of a plane crash, Columbine at the Parkland, et cetera. So the perception is burned into the public's mind that this is a dangerous population. So yes, while it's true that most mass killers have a problem, or they're really bad people, or both, they're not typical of people who commit murder. Most people who commit murder are normal people who happen to own guns. But that's not something that most people actually believe or know when they read these stories that are in newspapers. That is one of the things that drives me crazy. So the perception people have of mental illness and the people with mental illness is very much shaped by the way we talk about it and cover it. And often it's an innocent thing. You hear, I was thinking recently about a report by a friend of mine in the Times, Ben Carey, about antidepressant withdrawal syndrome. And it's true, if you stop antidepressants, you can have discontinuation effects that are uncomfortable. But it's actually very mild. And every once in a while, you have somebody who has trouble. But if you look at all the randomized clinical trial data and you talk to clinicians, maybe you'll get a handful of clinicians who will say, there are people that have a very hard time. But the article focused on the small number of people who had a hard time. So I had people calling me up saying, I think I should stop my antidepressant now because I'm going to get addicted and these terrible things are going to happen to me. And I said, but that's a tiny number of people. So what was missing in the article was any sense of the denominator. Okay, so you have 10 people. 10 people out of what? 10 people out of 100? 10 people out of 1 million? 10 people out of 5 million? So you need to give the public some sense of risk, and which to me is another issue in covering the mentally ill, which is we are so focused on proportional risk. So you say something like, this new drug was just reported to be 5 times more likely to be harmful to the liver than the old drugs. That's very scary. I wouldn't want to take this drug. 5 times the risk. But what if it turns out it's, let's say, 5 in 2 million as opposed to 1 in 2 million? What people really want to know is absolute risk. I mean, proportional risk is very scary, but it's misleading. It's just another example of how, both the mentally ill and the treatment for people with mental illness, I think, can be misleadingly described unless you give these rates and you give context and you give all that kind of this data that allows people to actually look at it. The other thing I think that we could do better is that whenever something comes up, some new finding, some new sexy finding comes up, everybody says, oh, this seems so exciting, it's going to completely revolutionize the field. You should be very skeptical. I mean, new studies should be like recipes. If you try a recipe once, you like to try it a couple of times to see if it's reproducible. If it's a good recipe and you do it multiple times, you'll get the same result. If it's a bad recipe, meaning a bad study, it won't replicate. Or if it's an uninformative study, it won't replicate because they did something odd. They looked at an unusual sample of people. So I would say whenever you get these very, unusual reports of study results, you should be very skeptical if they seem to overturn a mountain of evidence that's over here. Not that it might, but I think we should be more circumspect and skeptical. And when I'm writing about those things, I always try to say, this is very intriguing, but maybe it will be replicated. Maybe it won't be replicated. And it's another way to think about this particular issue or this particular phenomenon. I've discovered that people get very upset when you say things that are at odds with what they believe. And people will email passionate emails about you missed this, or how come you believe this when the evidence suggests otherwise. And you're basically just presenting new information, saying this is yet another way to consider this. Not that this is the truth, but science is this self-correcting process, and we're going to learn more about this, and we're going to get all kinds of discrepant results, and its uncertainty is not comfortable. I think people like to have a very sort of firm view about what is true and what isn't true. There were a couple of other things I wanted to cover. Yeah. You have a question?
No.
Oh, no, I mean, I could go on and on and on, but maybe what would be more interesting is to have a discussion with you and talk about any of these issues or anything related to this area.
If you have questions, let me go turn the microphone on. Please line up here. I'll ask the first question. Please get in line. I'd love for you to discuss, because I think that people are curious inside a newspaper, and you're both inside and outside, and you're also a source for other journalists, so you see the whole thing. So you talked a little bit about the challenge of what people want to believe, and this is true for writers and editors too, and what they want to believe sometimes is why a story is a story that the publication wants to do, and when the thing that you want to believe isn't quite as cool, maybe it's less of a story. So in a time of contracting media, and even, I mean, you even talked about the Times doing things that that maybe felt like they were not exactly right based on the study, but that challenge strikes me as one of the key challenges for readers, for writers, for editors. And I guess part of it is, how do we do stories that are not the sexiest stories but are the right stories? But also, how do we deal with this issue of what people want to believe in assigning, in interviewing, and in writing stories?
Right. It's such a great question. Because in parallel, it very much mirrors, how journal editors make a decision about what they're going to publish. For example, negative studies are not published with the same frequency as positive studies, both because, previously there have been reforms that prevent this from happening, but investigators can withhold their data and decide not to publish it. And in the same way, editors have to think about, well, what is timely, or what do I want the public to know about? And I know from experience that they would rather publish at the Times, for example, at least in the op-eds side of things, something which is counterintuitive and doesn't cover something that's already been talked about. So if you're presenting a point of view which has been covered in the news and everyone is likely to know it, they're not interested in publishing it, which means they're selecting for contrarian, points of view. Sometimes they're reasonable and sometimes they're not reasonable. Sometimes they'll ask me, because they have, a pet idea, would you consider writing X? And, well, for example, recently, one of the editors said that a family member who has a child with autism was told by a friend that she should consider using cannabidiol, CBD, for treatment. And she wondered about this. And then I thought about it, and that weekend I was downtown, and I saw in the ads, CBD oil and CBD, and suddenly I saw that CBD was everywhere. I don't know where I was before this, but it was in coffee, it was in latte, it was in creams, and I thought, why is it? And then I started to look at the science, and I thought, okay, this is worth writing about, only because somebody brought it to my attention. I never would have thought of it. It wasn't something in the front of my mind, but having this dangled in front of me, I thought, okay, I'm going to do this. Sometimes I'll say, no, actually, I think that the obvious point of view is the right point of view, and writing something that's, just raising a question about it for the sake of being, let's say contrarian is really not interesting. It's not productive. But there's definitely a bias towards the innovative, the counterintuitive, the point of view which has not yet been aired publicly, or something which frankly overturns what everybody believes. And it may be that's consistent with my own cognitive bias, because the things that I most want to write about are things that surprise me. That if I come across something that's at odds with what I think is the case, I'm very interested in it. So I saw an article recently about suicide rates going up, 20-something% between 2010 and 2017, and I was alarmed by this, and I thought, what is this? And I thought, that sounds very scary. So I went back and I looked at the vital statistics for 100 years, and what I discovered was something very different, which was the suicide rates, yes, have gone up in the last 10 years, but if you look at the vital statistics for the last 100 years, it looks like this. The real story was suicide rates haven't budged. They've been much higher than this in the last 100 years. For example, after 1933 in the crash, they were 17 in 100,000. Now they're around 13 in 100,000. For a low in our lifetime, about 10 in 100,000 or something like that. So I wrote something about, yes, it looks like we should be very alarmed, and it's upsetting to see this, and we're in this one part of this cycle. But the real story is, why have we been unable to make any progress in a public health problem as serious as suicide? That, to me, was the bigger issue. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Me? Hi, I'm Helene Ellison, and my husband Russell and colleagues from Johns Hopkins and Lionsgate Films have just started an organization called the Media Empathy Foundation. And we're looking not just at the news media, but also at the way mental illnesses are depicted in television, film, social media, children's media. The question is, first, we've come to violence as the common thread that creates fear of people with mental illnesses. Do you agree with that? Is more data needed to really hone in on that? And is it a story that can be used to create greater empathy with the media, to really be able to shed a light on that?
Yeah, I very much think that, the mentally ill are portrayed as, irrationally, they're portrayed as much, much more dangerous than they actually are. It's also true the risk is a little higher than the general population, but it's not a lot higher. But in popular entertainment, you run against the desire to make these, really exciting, scary movies. And I mean, to me, what would be the most frightening is what's real. What's real is what Hitchcock said when he was driving around the English countryside. It's really peaceful. He looks out the window and he says to his companion, it's a beautiful place. The perfect murder happens here every day. And you hear this every time that there's a mass killing. The comment constantly is, he was such a nice guy. He looked like such a normal person. When in fact, most violence is committed by people just like us, and against people who they have contact with. So it's not the monsters, though those are the things that, the movies focus on. It's everyday reality. That to me is far more frightening.
Hi, I'm Courtney. I'm a freelance journalist in Philadelphia. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about where you see work on treatment-resistant depression heading. Are there any new treatments that you're seeing? Or
So there's very intense interest in research in the area of resistant depression. I mean, there's a lot of focus now on things you've heard about, like drugs that affect the glutamate system of the brain, and in particular the NMDA receptor, like ketamine and drugs that are related to ketamine. And they do seem to have promise. And although there are some, downsides to them and problems with side effects. And one of the biggest challenges is we don't actually understand what causes depression. And depression is a complicated illness that has a lot of inputs that make it come about, both in terms of biology and genes and the environment. And so you're not talking about one disease, you're probably talking about multiple different biological types. So one of the challenges is understanding a little more about what actually makes it happen, the cause, and then identifying new targets. So glutamate is one promising one, but there are others.
Yeah. But what about the endurance factor of some of those treatments, like maintenance?
Well, maintenance studies are costly and they take a long time to conduct. And so, right now when they do investigational studies for new drugs, it's first question, does it work? The second question is, can we make it work a long time? How enduring is the effect? So that's the next phase. Yeah.
If I can just follow up on that, what is an appropriate way to cover this kind of work as it's going? Because you raised the issue of whether you can go too far, you can write about it being too promising, you can write about it being too negative. Ketamine work recently, I've seen a number of stories that are very, very optimistic, and in the end they say well, but maybe not. So I'm wondering what language do we use to be realistic and also get readers?
So I think the way to do it is to put it in the context of what is now currently available. So you give people a general idea that these are the currently available therapeutics, and they have the following profile and the following effect size, which is a measure of how effective something is. And here is this newcomer, and it has these characteristics, and we don't yet know, because we don't have enough evidence to say how it stacks up to the older drugs. It looks good, but you need a lot of data to actually show that something is safe and effective. And since a lot of mood disorders are chronic illnesses that people have to live with for their lifetime, the real test of the treatment is not just that it gets people to feel better for 8 days or 8 weeks, it's that it stops them from getting depressed in the future, prevents the illness. So you need that kind of information in covering the story. And then you just have to be reading constantly about new studies that come out that basically raise questions about new drugs. And there was one recently in the summer where an investigator who was trying to understand how ketamine worked decided he would do a study and give people ketamine along with an opiate blocker. And lo and behold, a lot of the antidepressant effect was blocked, which suggests one interpretation is ketamine works because it has opioid effects. That's a little worrisome, and it's an anesthetic. So, the story is not so clear. So that's the kind of information I think the public wants to know and needs to know.
Hi there. My name's Aditi Banlamudi. I'm a reporter for the Guns in America project, which means that I report on guns, and the majority of the time I report on gun violence. And whenever there is a mass shooting, often people have this thought that the crime is so heinous that anyone who could have committed something like this must be mentally ill. And I have trouble trying to retort back with facts, and I wondered if you had any ideas on how to walk that line and disprove this idea that people with mental illnesses are violent.
So you have to first deal with the statistical reality, which is most mass killers are unlike everyday homicide perpetrators, and acknowledge that that population of people is different than everybody else. And there's data about that. There's a really wonderful series of Mother Jones looking at, all mass killings for the last 20 or 30 years. And it's very hard to actually get good data because a lot of the mass killers either kill themselves or are killed. But there are people that have collected cases over many years showing that the majority of these people have a certain profile. They tend to be young men who are paranoid, who nurse a grudge, who have clear mental health issues. So you have to acknowledge that this is a select sample, and it's not, although many of them have mental health problems. they're not representative of overall violence in the United States. You have to explain to people that if you were to remove the mentally ill from the population, that the rates of homicide would drop no more than 3 or 4%. Because serious mental illness is a rare thing, and it contributes very little to the overall risk of violence. So you have to do two things. You have to say, yes, these people who are mass killers are more likely to have mental illness, but they're really not the population problem.
Can we, I think that this issue will come up again and again and again today if we don't sort of put it on pause. And I would say that the issue that you started with, I think, is a question that I would also like to hear you answer, which is separate from whether we need to give advice about what the percentage of people who are violent, which is honestly a different issue. When you're a reporter covering a mass shooting, I think her question is apropos. Should the reporter be assuming that someone who did this is mentally ill? Is the ability, because reporters do make these choices, or their editors make them for them when they come in, how they're going to portray somebody. Is somebody who killed, is it reasonable for a journalist, I guess I would ask it this way, to have the perspective, or even to ask the question whether this person who did this thing, whether that person is mentally ill? Not the bigger issue, because the bigger issue is the bigger issue when we're covering this story and this person.
My own view is you want the truth. And if you don't have the data, you don't speculate. So you basically report what people actually know at the time, which is very little is known about the perpetrator. He lived at such and such a place, and how can you say in a front page story with such significance that you think, there's gossip or you believe without evidence? I just wouldn't do it. I just think you want the data, and if you can't get the data, I don't think you should speculate about it.
I think that's related to my question, actually. You talked a lot about reporting on a study or on data, but my question is if you could talk about the responsibility of when there is a phenomenon of like a mental health issue and long-form narrative journalism that seems to try and explain the phenomenon. I actually have an example for you. I was studying psychology at UPenn before I came here, and the New York Times actually did an article about our abnormally high rates of suicide, but I felt like the etiology really narrowed it down to just like we're all perfectionists. But it didn't really get at, I think, the whole picture, or even really talk about like the mental health services being provided and a lot of that stuff. But I think it was an interesting topic for sure, and definitely a phenomenon that needed written about, but sort of as a journalist, sometimes the etiology assumed isn't necessarily the whole picture, I think, is like a common thing I've seen in journalism across long-form narrative.
You mean the one hypothesis will be proposed when there might be multiple that would explain the same thing you're talking about?
Yeah, I think there's almost always multiple, not just like one factor, but in general, yeah, it just ends up becoming this one reason for this whole kind of complicated phenomenon, I think.
It would seem to me that it would be more interesting, especially to readers, to entertain the possibility that although you're thinking about it from this perspective and that's the hypothesis you have, that there are other possible explanations for the same thing. Mm-hmm. Because people are going to wonder about it anyway.
Yeah, definitely.
And if you actually think that your explanation is the right one, where the others are less likely to be true, you can anticipate that in an argument and say, and yes, although these are alternative explanations, it's unlikely to be true for reason A, B, C, and D.
I also had a quick second, which is just that I was wondering how much you work with like movie critiques, because I do think I also took a class on the movies and was blown away by how much I would think it's a great movie, and then I like analyzed the stereotypes and was like blown away. Like, I love A Beautiful Mind, and then I realized, well, actually schizophrenic patients don't really usually see a whole complete person. It's a little bit different, more shapes and voices and just so many examples. And I wonder if you ever work with the art side, actually, the movie critiques.
Never.
Okay, interesting.
Although you're giving me an idea.
I'm interested in what I believe is the object of today's conference, I had worked at a major cancer and research center for quite a while, where you could figure out who was a person at the Wall Street Journal who would write about your mouse studies that were promising, and who was the person who would write about the cancer drugs or the cancer patients, etc. So people had a beat, but that was when newspapers had science and health sections. And little by little, they were, among the first to go, and then sometimes the newspapers were the next to go.
Mm-hmm.
And I worked at NBC Nightly News. There was a medical unit for Nightly News, and there was a medical unit for the Today Show. And now there's one sort of medical unit, but not a dedicated correspondent. And so while I think it's important you need accuracy, otherwise what good is it to be written about? But in some ways, I think you are taking a job of a journalist, not that you aren't a journalist, because the schools aren't preparing journalists who are accurate, who understand, is this caused, is it, a coincidence, is it whatever? And lastly, before I let you comment, Johns Hopkins does something called Science Writers Boot Camp. I think it's been 9 years now. And they do an entire day. They do it at the Washington Press Club, so you don't have to go to Baltimore. And there's one topic. It could be cardiac, it could be cancer, it could be immunology. They have researchers, they have physicians, everything. And they educate journalists. And the one I attended last year had over 90 journalists. And so, I think in this changing time, there's lots of challenges, and I just wondered if you can address how to deal with the challenges to get better journalists without having to have doctors have a fun sideline, but somebody else is unemployed and writing for some online that no one reads. No offense to anybody.
So you want me to write comments on how to make myself obsolete? Well, I do this because it's fun, basically, because I enjoy doing it. And I would say, if you're thinking about educating journalists to be, more analytically competent, so you're always going to need to talk to people who know more than you do about something, because you have a skill, but you may not have knowledge base about the area that you write about. So you have to...
Excuse me 1 second. I'm also, in educating them, is how to find out who the right source is, how to know to call you before they have an opinion. That's part of being a journalist,
Right.
is to know who...
But I'm assuming that in a school like Columbia, you teach your...
We got that.
Yeah. And also you learn about, basic, scientific reporting, and, you learn a little bit about, the design of studies. You learn about the difference between causation and, correlation, and something about reverse causation and things like this. And also that you know that if you have a question about something or a study, you always have access to call experts who are either in that area, or something I do is call a friend who's a statistician and say, this is very intriguing, but I don't actually understand the method was used. To me, I love to get into the method, like how was the study actually done? And the results you all find fascinating because they're intriguing and they're sexy. But to me, the real issue is, was it a well-designed study, and how did they conduct it? How did they go about doing that? That's what you really want.
We can only take one more quick question. There's been time for other questions today. Thank you. And can the second panel line up over here, so we'll get them up there, but go ahead.
Hi, I'm Ryan Lindsay. I'm also with Guns in America at Connecticut Public Radio. I'm wondering if you have thoughts about something that seems to be an intersection between health and science, biases society and reality. It feels like there's a trend where, especially if there's particularly a white man who commits a mass murder, then down the line an insanity plea will come up. And so, for instance, or not just a mass murder, but the man who slit the throat of Nia Wilson, who was the 18-year-old in Oakland, now down the line this insanity plea comes up, and so then that obviously calls into question whether or not some sort of justice can be achieved, or just very much takes that in a different course. So I'm just wondering if you have thoughts about how to have this conversation about when issues of mental health arise that can also shift kind of the trajectory of something that's happened. And something along those lines I think about often.
So I couldn't tell whether you mean, is there just a disparity in the way things are covered because of the, perpetrator based on, whether it's somebody of a certain ethnic or racial group, or any group, so long as the question of mental illness comes up along the way? Because it almost always does in these cases of mass killers.
Yeah, I think that generally there tends to be more of a sympathy of some sort if you're able to say, well, this person, be it Adam Lanza or Dylan Roof or somebody, has a mental health issue, and then how that sometimes can be a blanket coverage to address other issues of actual violence, racism, and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, you should go after that, and my view is that conversation is actually used to steer attention away from the one that is politically much more charged and controversial, which has to do with the access to firearms. That everybody would love to focus on what you just talked about instead of the obvious, which is that if you didn't have access to these, assault rifles, what would you be able to do with your impulses? Maybe you'd hit somebody. That, to me, is the bigger issue.
Thank you.